Hello and welcome to this LinkedIn Live session. My name is Alessandro Faia. I'm a communications officer at EMA. And today I'm joined by the European Medicines Agency Chief Medical Officer, Steffen Thirstrup, to talk about psychedelics and their potential therapeutic use. Before we start our discussion, I want to remind you that you can ask your questions by posting them in the comment section. And we will address the questions in the second part of this live chat. So psychedelics is an umbrella term that includes a number of substances like psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and they have been experiencing a quiet renaissance. So both in terms of public opinion, there's a lot of interest, lots of books, hours of videos on YouTube, podcasts, and so forth. But there is also a growing interest in clinical research, especially in the mental health area, where we have which is an area of unmet medical need. So EMA recently held a workshop, a 2-day workshop on psychedelics. And my first question to you, Steffen, is: so do they deserve a second chance?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me here, and thank you for all of you who listens in and follow this on LinkedIn. Yes, I believe psychedelics deserves a second chance. Of course, we don't know for sure yet whether these products can fulfill the promise of helping patients with unmet medical need in special different mental disorders. But the studies we've seen so far have been published are rather positive. And knowing that these compounds have been a little bit out in the dark for since the 70s, I would say there was some research in the 70s. I don't think that research really is up to the standard of research we want to see today. But newer studies are pointing towards an effect. So I believe that there is an opportunity for a second chance. Also because we've seen, as you said, an enormous growth in mental disorders, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And looking back for the past decade, we haven't really seen any new therapeutic advancements for mental disorders. So this is worth a second chance.
Exactly. So in terms of then developing these substances to be, let's say, ready for submission as a treatment, I mean, there is a long way between the potential and then the development. Do you think that the EU regulatory system is nimble enough and has the appropriate tools to help developers?
We definitely have the right tools available to help developers. I think one of the aims of the workshop we held last month was also to bring together all relevant stakeholders here. Not only the developers, but also the academic researchers who are doing a lot of the trials here, but of course also patients and caretakers in the field. We definitely have our tools. Of course, we have the classical scientific advice, which is a very more heavy procedure, I must say, and really targeting pharma industry. But we also have lessons where you, as a small and medium-sized enterprise, can engage with us, and especially the engagement possibility for academics. And I think it's important to bring all the stakeholders together here, because you alluded to the science we already seen, and there are some challenges around the science we've seen, especially some of these trials are rather small from a regulatory standpoint, and they are of relatively short duration. So one of the questions is, how long will the effect last after psychedelic therapy? Is there a need for retreatment and so forth? So these kind of questions the current published studies do not really answer.
And expanding a little bit on the trials and on how these substances would then be used as treatments. An important role is the fact that they will be complementary normally to psychotherapy. So I guess this was also discussed during the workshop, and maybe you can summarize it for us.
Yeah, maybe before I do that, it's important to say our viewpoint and our set point for this discussion is, of course, to explore whether these products can end up as licensed product, as medicinal products, and the requirements to do so we can discuss later on. And I think it's important also to have the discussion around how would these medicines end up being implemented in the healthcare system should they pass the hurdle of being approved as a medicinal product. And one of the discussions is around set and setting. So the mindset of the patient that goes into the psychedelic therapy, but also the setting around where this therapy happens. And so far, most of the studies has been done as psychotherapy, as psychedelic assisted therapy. So meaning that there is a baseline psychotherapy where you utilize the effect of psychedelic to modify or improve that psychotherapy. Which is, of course, if that's an intention, then you need to do the clinical trials in a way that mimics that setup. If you want to approach psychedelics as just something you can take in a controlled setting where you will be supervised by a nurse or some other setter who do not really intervene other than protecting you from harming yourself and what else can happen in the psychedelic during the psychedelic experience, then you have to do your studies that way, and that would also potentially affect the way these products are going to be authorized and labeled.
And do you think that because we know that there are a number of trials that are ongoing worldwide, mostly for using, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder or treatment-resistant depression. But we see also in the news that there's a lot of interest, and there's currently one MDMA therapy that is just been designated as a breakthrough by the FDA. Do you think that developers are focusing more on the US market? And what would be your message to them?
Well, yes, one of the reasons that we started having a little bit extra interest for psychedelics here was actually that we noted companies announcing that they had received breakthrough therapy designation by the US Food and Drug Administration. And we looked into how many companies actually had been here for scientific advice, and there were a few. It is actually some years back since they were here last time. And I was a little bit concerned also from the patient perspective and public health perspective in Europe, that all the development were done in the US, focusing on the US way of treating these disorders, and that the companies and the developers didn't really consider the European market and the European requirements, not only the regulatory requirements, which are fairly aligned with the US, but maybe also the requirements that may come after authorization linked to pricing and reimbursement in Europe. And to deal with that, I think it's important that regulators also engage with the European agency.
And do you think that the scheduling of these substances, so the fact that their distribution and use is tightly regulated, so is an obstacle to research, or is it something that proactively can be overcome?
That's a yes and a no. It's correct that this product has been Schedule 1 since 1971, and it is a national legislation that regulates to what extent you can use scheduled products in clinical research. And looking across Europe, some member states are very flexible, allowing clinical trials. We are aware that there are several clinical trials ongoing in Europe with psychedelic therapy for many different indications. But we certainly also know that there are member states who do not allow not even clinical trials, and definitely not use therapeutic use. So there will be a challenge should these products in the end up being approved. There will be a challenge, at least in some member states, for using them, which could call for rescheduling. But we are not the regulatory authority that can reschedule the products, nor can the European Monitoring Center for Drugs do. It is a UN classification, so it has to be brought up to United Nations level if we're going to change the scheduling on a global scale.
Going back to the workshop, there were all actors were present in the workshop. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of engagement. Do you think that having patients, doctors, regulators, industry, small, medium enterprises, academia, all at the same table, so that collaboration is a key to enable innovation?
I think it's crucially important, not only for psychedelics, but I would say for any drug development, that you think from nose to tail, so to speak, that you involve the key subjects are the patients. They are the ultimate one who is going to hopefully benefit from these medicines. And without patient engagement and patients' willingness to volunteer for clinical trials, we would never be able to develop any medicines. So the patients are definitely key around the table. Secondly, of course, we need to have the developers around the table. And I think in this particular case, having the academic researchers here is equally important, because a lot of the research that is happening now is academic research that also goes into better understanding how psychedelics potentially are working to alleviate mental disorders. And that understanding will be important also for the developers when designing clinical trials.
So I want to remind you again that if you want to ask some questions, please use the comments section. We have received some questions ahead of the live, actually, and one was focusing on the quality aspect. So we know that there is, it's one thing to have a natural substance that has an effect, but it's another thing to then take that substance and then have a process that responds to certain quality criteria. And so I think our listener was inquiring, so how would you then make sure that this substance is produced according to the rigid quality standards that are...
That's an important question, because the psychedelics are natural occurring compounds, so fundamentally you could derive them from nature. From our perspective as medicines regulators, it's important that the product that is brought to the market and brought to the patients are safe and effective, and that it's being manufactured in a consistent way to reassure that the content of the tablets, let's say, is the same today, tomorrow, and next year, and that the tablets are stable within a certain time frame, and they do not contain any unwanted substances and substances that could elicit an adverse event. And that is more challenging if you want to develop a product from natural resources. The standardizations become much more complex. So most of the products that I foresee that potentially could be brought to the market will be synthetic derived products. And here we will apply the same quality standards, as we call it, the pharmaceutical quality standards, that we would apply to any other pharmaceutical.
And maybe I can ask another question that is connected to this one. So to make this really clear, so the evaluation of a psychedelic therapy, let's say a candidate psychedelic therapy, the steps would actually reflect, the same steps that the evaluation of any other substance would have to.
This is our outset that if these medicines are going to be approved products in Europe for therapeutic use, they will have to comply with the rules and regulations that we have in place. This will be based on scientific principles, so you will have to do clinical trials, you will have to establish that the products are safe, and of course, first and foremost, effective, and the effectiveness is in place, and that you do via clinical trials. Then the manufacturing, as we just touched upon, need to also be accordance to European standards and global standards. And all that documentation will then, like for any other products, have to be submitted to us and reviewed by our scientific committee. And ultimately, the scientific committee would issue, if positive, a recommendation for approval.
This ties in with a question we received from Tadeusz Havrot. I hope I didn't butcher your name. Given what's happening around the world, and especially the likely FDA approval this year, and given the scale of unmet medical needs in mental health, would the EU be willing to look at the US clinical data and consider some form of early access?
Yeah, thank you, Tadeusz, for that question. Definitely, we would not take the US, the potential, this is a theoretical situation, the potential US approval and just rubber stamp that in Europe. But definitely the clinical data that has go into any FDA review, we are of course willing to look at. There may be some caveats here, like in any other therapeutic area, that the development may have taken place in a setup that is different from the European setup, which we will have to consider. But knowing the therapeutic field, I would say that for most cases, there will not be a major difference. So US data can definitely be used in Europe as well.
Go to the next one from Paul Houston. With some drugs, a shaman role is common. This does beg the question, are psychotherapists going to take these drugs so they can give advice from a personal point of view and indeed from personal enlightenment?
Well, this alludes a little bit to the more recreational use of these products, but also to the question around set and setting, because the traditional use of many psychedelics has been with a shaman and some culture around this. And of course, if that's going to be part of a therapy, I would have doubt that many hospital systems will be able to implement a therapy session with a shaman. And another concern around this is, of course, that we've seen that in other questions, that if these products end up being licensed medicinal product, it would have an impact on the potential for recreational use. I have to stress that recreational use already is illegal because these products are Schedule I products. But of course, if you go into the woods and pick mushrooms and eat them, no one will be able to enforce any laws here. But synthetically developed products will be illegal. The fact that we end up licensing these medicines potentially, I would say, for any product, not only in psychedelics, but if a compound that can be used recreational also could have a therapeutic benefit and have an impact on public health, I think the public health perspective will outweigh the recreational thing, and we should go for approving such products.
Okay, then the following question is from Marlene Halser. Are there already applications for approval for someone? If not, why? I think we touched upon this, but maybe it's useful to...
I think I'm not disclosing anything too much here to say we currently don't have any psychedelics marketing authorization applications under review in Europe. We are very keen to talk to developers, both at an earlier stage, but definitely also to review anything they believe is fit for purpose to bring a product to the market. We are aware that applications are undergoing a review by the US FDA.
Right, and then another question that it's also about evaluation and potential timelines. So how long would it take for EMA to approve these substances if all goes well and science validates the results?
So the typical review of a marketing authorization in Europe is 210 days, which are 210 days on our side, and there you need to add the days the company will need to respond to questions from our side. So a rule of thumb is that from the day the application lands here at the table in Amsterdam, roughly a year will pass before a marketing authorization can be in place. So that's the rule of thumb. There may be a situation where we can speed up the review process by a couple of months, but that puts some extra requirements on the application to really be in top shape and really fit for purpose.
So 210 days plus clock stops.
Yeah.
Don't think we have, no, we have one more question. Maria Beatrice Panico, does the PDCO have a view regarding the use of psychedelics in adolescents, and how is it possible to engage with them before formalizing a PIP? The pediatric investigation.
Yeah, a PIP is a pediatric investigation plan, and it is a requirement in Europe that when you develop medicines for adults, you need to consider whether that medicines also is eligible for development for children. And we know mental disorders are present in children. So there will be a requirement also for these products to engage with our pediatric committee. And I think what is hidden in this question is that it's difficult to outline a clinical development program for the pediatric population before you really have done your clinical development in adults. And the pediatric committee, the PEDCO, acknowledges this challenge, and you can actually already now apply for an engagement with the PEDCO to discuss how to move forward with at least an outline of how you're going to approach this. And another option is also that you apply for a deferral, which basically is an application that's saying we need to establish safety and efficacy in adults before we can go into pediatrics. I don't know how the PEDCO, the pediatric committee, will view such an application, but that would definitely also be a way forward.
And before we go to the next question, maybe it's useful to talk a little bit about the how EMA approached the guideline, for example, for so EMA has taken a different route than the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So the FDA had developed a guideline specifically suited for psychedelics, while EMA went a different route. Maybe you want to quickly explain?
Yeah, U.S. FDA have developed a guideline specifically on psychedelics, and I think that's an interesting guideline. I don't think we fundamentally disagree with the content of that guideline. The approach in Europe has been a little bit the other way around, to say we want to add a paragraph to our current therapeutic guidelines on the potential use of psychedelic and studies in psychedelic, and what the requirements for studying psychedelics in that therapeutic areas. And the first example is the current revision of the guideline for studies of medicinal product for depression. So the depression guideline actually have a proposal for a change there, and I can foresee, as this area hopefully develops further, that we can see other additions to other guidelines on the requirements the requirements we would like to see when studying psychedelics in that therapeutic field.
So more questions from our viewers. Carl Henholm is asking, could EMA approve compounds and override individual national members' legislations?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question as well, and maybe I'm gonna see if I can give a short answer without having to read the entire legislation. Fundamentally, these products are not eligible to what is called the centralized procedure. So it means that it's up to the developer where they will seek the marketing authorization. The centralized procedure is a procedure where you get marketing authorization in all 27 member states during one application, and the marketing authorization is issued by the European Commission and is by that valid in all 27 member states. So you can say a marketing authorization that is supported by the European Medicines Agency overrides national marketing authorization. But if you as a developer rather would like just to develop your product for certain countries, you can choose some of the transnational transnational review procedures called the mutual recognition procedure, decentralized procedure, where you pick the number of countries that you utilize. I must say most innovative companies and innovative products go via the centralized procedure. But definitely psychedelics do not need to use the centralized procedure.
Okay, then Nina Brismoon is asking, would you recommend using the PRIME scheme for these types of drugs?
We haven't seen any application for the PRIME scheme, and maybe for other listeners, PRIME stands for priority medicine. So this is a way for us to help developers accelerate promising innovative products. I would say if I was a developer in a therapeutic area in mental health, I would consider applying for Prime. I cannot here promise whether you will get a Prime access, but I would consider that application.
And a question about the use of inactive placebos in the control arm in clinical trials for psychedelics. So what would be our position if we can apply that on employing an inactive placebo?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, and I don't think I can be too detailed because it will depend on the substance you are investigating, and of course the therapeutic area you're investigating. But as an outset for new compounds, having a placebo-controlled trial is in many instances desirable. And we know from many mental disorders that the placebo response, at least the placebo response that we have seen with traditional antipsychotics and antidepressant, is rather huge. So we need to be able to disentangle the effect of the psychedelic in this case and the placebo effect. So far so good. That's the theoretical here. The challenge is, of course, to find a placebo that do not break the blinding, because taking psychedelics, I think, is an experience I have never tried myself, I must say, but it's definitely an experience that people is not unaware that something is happening. Whereas classical placebo is an inert tablet where nothing happens. So finding the suitable placebo is not really possible. So a lot of different approaches has been taken, either to use low dose of the subtherapeutic doses, or using other medication that have an effect on the central nervous system that may be perceived by the study subject as a psychedelic experience. There's no good answer here. There's no yes or no here. I think it's the most important advice to the developers is that to consider their choice of comparator, placebo, low dose, alternatives, and create the study that it takes into account the potential biases that selection requires and address it in their analysis.
Steffen, so we have another question about are there any plans to address the harm reduction aspect by educating residents of the EU about psychedelics? I think it's slightly out of scope, maybe.
But maybe I can take the other approach, because I think it's a little bit linked to these products being scheduled products, linked to the fact that we need trials of a certain length to be able to fully understand the long-term potential negative effects of these products. And should any of these products make it through the review process, I'm sure that we, on top of the classical pharmacovigilance, so the adverse event reporting that is mandatory for every new product, most likely also would create a risk management plan, given that these products so far are scheduled products. So there will be a kind of education to not the general public, but at least to the patients who are going to be subject to such treatment, about being very careful and being notable on any adverse events.
We had another question from Georg Obermeier, which I think you responded to between the lines. Will the EMA make any recommendations regarding the status of psychedelics as Schedule 1 substance? I think we said that's not.
Yeah, it's not us who can reschedule the products, but if science moves on and these products are getting closer to getting a marketing authorization, it's definitely something that we would recommend to the UN to consider rescheduling. But that's going to be on a global scale, and maybe other parts of the world will not be as happy around having psychedelics available than we are currently thinking that we potentially could be here in Europe and North America.
And Anton Gomez Escolar is asking, a topic we discussed, which is still uncertain, is how we could approach the standardization of training for clinicians who will be working with these compounds. Could the EMA help with that, or is it out of its scope?
It's a good question, and it's also linked to the previous discussion around set and setting, and also how these products are going to potentially, if approved, move from our hands into the hands of the clinicians. it's not our scope to train clinicians or provide recommendations, but we are definitely open. And I think that was also part of the discussion in our workshop, to work with the relevant scientific societies, European Psychiatry Society, and so forth, on what would be relevant guidance to physician and psychotherapists working with patients and these therapies.
Then another question from Marlene Helzer. What are the most promising studies, more interesting for approval purposes? Maybe we cannot go as far as that.
No, we cannot go into details, and I would be very hesitant to favor one therapeutic area, one product over another. I think you can see what is going on from the announcement from different companies. I think at this stage, I will repeat what I said earlier. We are very keen on engaging with developers in the broadest thinkable sense, not only pharma companies, but also academia. And we welcome any application for marketing authorization here, independent on therapeutic area compound.
Okay, then Eric Vermetten is asking, paroxetine and sertraline were registered for PTSD by FDA and adopted by EMA. Yet now, for the current situation with MDMA approval by FDA, there would need to be done additional studies and not do mutual recognition. Please help clarify.
Well, the approval of sertraline and paroxetine was not an approval based on FDA's approval. That's a misunderstanding. We looked at the same data, and I am not aware of the details of those applications. But I would assume, back to the question we got earlier, that the studies were most likely the same studies forming the basis for the approval in Europe and US. But we did not approve as a kind of mutual recognition or so forth. We rarely do that. Our legislation do not allow for that. So that's a misunderstanding. And the extra studies that potentially may be needed here, I don't say that extra studies is needed. It will be highly dependent on how the studies that we will be seeing, that will be submitted here, how they have been conducted, and how good they fit into how good the setup is, how good the setup mimics the therapeutic situation in Europe. So I'm definitely not discarding using US trials in Europe.
Okay. Yes, some further question. So, Yeva Strodomskite. These products will need rigorous RMPs and educational materials for healthcare professionals. However, I believe healthcare professionals administering should have gone through psychedelic experience themselves. So, echoing the question we got before, to be able to properly support the patient and to recognize when something untoward is occurring in real time.
Well, I don't think I'm able to comment sufficiently on that. I haven't undergone psychedelic therapy myself, so I already discard myself there on that point. I'm not sure that is a requirement for many therapies here. You could, I know in some psychiatrists want to undergo psychoanalysis to practice that. I don't think that would be a requirement, at least not from our side. And it's a little bit linked to the question we had earlier around educating the healthcare professionals that are going to deal with patients here. It's out of our scope.
Okay, thank you, Steffen. I think we went a little bit over time, but it was an interesting discussion, and it was nice to see a lot of questions and high engagement for this topic. Thanks again for sharing your knowledge with us today. And I want to thank all the viewers, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.